Woo! Hello, my name's Lewis, and I'm going to be continuing my review of the question series. And from here on out, I'll be reviewing the series via these graphic novel collections. The first 6 issues of the series, I have them in single issues, and that is because when I started collecting the series in these graphic novel formats, the first graphic novel had already gone out of print, and at that point in time, anytime that I looked for it, the trade paperback was upwards of $80, and so I was never able to get the trade paperback. Now, unfortunately for me, and for anybody out there who's a collector, that having a story in 2 different formats, it drives me completely crazy. And so I'm asking if anybody out there in YouTube land is feeling generous and has sympathy for a poor YouTuber who can't afford to buy an $80 graphic novel. If you want to send that to me, I will love you forever. I promise. All right, that being said, I'm gonna be reviewing today issues 7 and 8 of the question. Both of those are standalone stories. They don't really connect with anything outside of them. They have their own themes, their own issues, and I'm gonna be reviewing just those 2 issues in this video. So let's get right into it. Let's start with issue number 7. Issue number 7 opens up with a picture of a man. He's hunched over a wild animal that he's killed, and he's eating it raw, just like a wild animal would. And from there, we essentially see the same man in a restaurant, and he's eating a piece of meat. Only now his hair is shaved. He has, he's well kempt. He looks like a civilized businessman. And we discover that this man is actually some sort of crime kingpin or drug kingpin, something to that effect. And so he's there in the restaurant eating. He has men around him protecting him, when all of a sudden a man walks up to him and tries to assassinate him from behind. But this man, having grown up in the jungle, is a very capable fighter, and so he attacks the assailant and essentially throws him out the window and escapes the attack. From there, we discover that he's actually trying to make a deal with the mayor of Hub City, who, as you all know, is a drunk and is not really capable of being in a leadership position. And so his wife, Myra, is actually the one that's running the show. In the past, he was being controlled by this evil reverend named Jeremiah Hatch, but Myra killed that man because that man tried to sacrifice her daughter to Satan. And so she kills the man, and so now she has actually taken his place as the person that's actually running the city behind the scenes, where while her husband basically spends all day drunk. So what happens is this jungle man, whose name is Volk, he comes to speak with the mayor, and we find out that he's trying to make some kind of deal with the mayor, but we don't exactly know what that deal is, except that when he encounters the mayor all drunk, he realizes that this mayor is completely useless, and he's not interested in making a deal with the mayor because of the fact that he doesn't respect him. And so Myra actually tries to convince him to make the deal with her, but he says that he doesn't make deals with women. And then he leaves her by telling her that she's a very beautiful woman, which I don't think really means anything to her, because of the fact that, what she really wants is to find out what this deal is that he's trying to make. So she ends up calling Vic Sage because of the fact that he's a reporter. She recognizes that he can do some investigating into what it is that Volk might have wanted to accomplish with this deal. And so they end up having this exchange where she calls upon him, and he tries initially he's asking her why, and she tells him because he's a good reporter and it would be good. And so he in his mind is wondering if it's not because of the fact that they used to have a relationship. And so she tries to assuage him and tell him, no, that, you know, that's not why. It is because you're a good reporter. And then she does something which I consider very noble. She actually tells him, look, I'm still attracted to you, and personally I would actually like to be with you, but I made a vow, I made a commitment to this man. Even if she was under duress when she made the commitment, she's still willing to live out her commitment to the man and to her vows, which is something that I think is very noble. And I think for the most part, society would like, or I think all of us would like to live in a society where all of us respect contracts, respect our word in that same sort of way. But unfortunately, I think that a lot of times our impulses get in the way of trying to live out that sort of an ideal. And this is not a judgment on anybody who hasn't been able to live out up to that ideal, but I do think that that ideal is a necessary ideal that all of us should be striving for, the ideal of living in accordance with our word. If we say that we're going to do something, we should do it. And if we're that sort of person, that we're going to become the sort of person that is mature enough to actually affect change and be a leader and all of that kind of stuff, which is ultimately what happens with Myra, that she is the sort of person that, because she is committed to her ideals, she actually ends up becoming a good leader for the city. Now, at the same time as Myra and Vic are meeting, there's a crime syndicate that's also meeting, and it's revealed that they were the ones that sent that assassin to try and kill Volk. So the crime syndicate decides, you know, they reveal that they had sent like an amateur to try and kill Volk, and they're like, you know, we should have never done that. Volk is obviously an experienced warrior. What we need to do is send experienced assassins, real dedicated assassins. And so they choose these 3 assassins that they're going to send after Volk to try and kill him. So from there, we go to Vic Sage's, not his home, it's actually Aristotle's home, but Vic Sage lives there. And Vic Sage is calling Volk repeatedly, trying to get information from Volk, trying to figure out what it is that Volk was going to do with Myra. I'm sorry, with Mayor Furman. And Volk refuses to answer any of his questions, and he keeps hanging up on him. So Vic Sage decides that he's gonna go and invest and question him as the question, because of the fact that he's not getting anywhere as Vic Sage. He thinks if he, you know, breaks into the guy's house and confronts him, that maybe he'll be able to get more answers that way. And then he and Aristotle have a kind of interesting discussion about situational ethics, because Aristotle asks him, okay, so you think it's okay to dress up as the question and break into somebody's house? That makes it okay because you're a different identity, but as Vic Sage, you wouldn't be willing to do that. And so Vic Sage says, sure, yeah, because sometimes ethics work in one situation, but then they don't work in another situation. And he uses the example of peacetime versus wartime. If you're in a situation where it's wartime and you kill an enemy, you're celebrated by your nation and by your society as a hero. But if you're you know, it's peacetime, it's, you know, you're in a society and you and an enemy have a dispute and you kill that person, you're labeled a murderer and you're put in jail, right? And so the idea there being that it's the same act, but in different situations, the act is treated differently. And I kind of wanted to explore that for a little bit, even though Vic Sage actually doesn't want to explore that too much. And maybe it's because he doesn't feel comfortable with his actual position. But Aristotle tries kind of pressing him on it. And he's like, look, I don't want to argue philosophy right now. And he decides to go and meditate. And, you know, again, maybe that's because he doesn't really want to think too much about the fact that what he's saying, if it's kind of pushed out to its logical conclusions, is not probably the best way to govern somebody's life. Because I do have to think that there is, in a sense, a place for situational ethics because, for example, is war an ethical is war ethical? Is, I guess, the question. Is two warring factions fighting with each other to the death something that's ethical? And see, I don't know what the answer to that is, because personally, I don't like the idea of saying that one person taking another person's life is ever ethical. But at the same time, when you have taking something like Nazi Germany, for example, when you have a system that is so utterly corrupt and it's trying to war with all of its surrounding nations, what is then your responsibility in terms of curbing that sort of unethical behavior? Is it okay, to go to the extreme of killing soldiers on behalf of that cause in order to, uphold righteousness as an ideal? And I'm tempted to say yes, because I don't really see what other solution there is. How are you supposed to negotiate? Because obviously the ideal situation, right, is if you have two warring ideals, you negotiate with each other. But what if one party is not willing at all to negotiate and is doing things that are so evil that they need to be stopped? But then at the same time, see, the tricky thing about that, right, is who's to say what what system is so evil that it needs to be extinguished? From my perspective, the Nazi system is very obviously that sort of a system. But there's a lot of different ethical systems in the world, and it's very difficult to say that this one ethical system over here is completely corrupt and needs to be extinguished, unless we have some sort of objective standard by which we measure ethics. And I'm not sure if I've said it in a video before. Personally, I'm a Christian, and so I have a standard by which I measure my ethics, but I also recognize that that's not the case for everybody in the world, and we're living in a society where we all have to get along with each other and accept each other's different ethical perspectives. And so how do we negotiate that? And the thing is too, that how far can we push the idea of situational ethics before we ourselves become corrupted, which is, it's kind of the issue here with the question. Just because you put on a mask and you do illegal things in that mask, is it okay for you to do it just because you're wearing a mask? How long before that seeps into your psyche and starts changing you as a person? Is it okay to lie in one situation but not to lie in other situations? If you start saying, sure, it's okay to lie in this situation, how long before you lying repeatedly how long does it take for that to start impacting you as a person before that actually makes you into somebody who depends on lying in order to live? And the truth is, I don't know. That's why ultimately that's personally, that's one of the reasons that I am a Christian, is because I think that you need something to come up against at the top level that says, look, okay, you can't go any farther than this. It's once you pass this boundary, things are wrong. And so I don't know how we manage these things. But anyways, let's keep going with the story. So Vic Sage, he becomes the question, and he goes over to where Voke is staying. We find out that Voke is in the top level of an apartment, or kind of like a motel complex. And Vic Sage breaks into his apartment. I'm gonna call, I don't want to say foul, but I find this very strange here. So Vic Sage, he catapults himself up the fire escape. First of all, I don't understand why he goes backwards here instead of going forwards, and then he like jumps and then does like a backflip up to the top, and I don't really understand why he needs to to do all of that, just to climb the fire escape. But anyways, he does that. He's a superhero. It has to be fancy. And then as he approaches the window, Volk is inside of the motel, and he's playing with this whip that he acquired at some point in the past. And Volk, because of the fact that he has these kind of animal instincts, he senses the question outside of his window, and he actually snaps the whip through the window, catching the question by the throat, and yanks the question into the apartment building and starts questioning the question as to who he is. The question tells him, look, I'm not your enemy, I'm here to help. And Volk, by feeling the vibrations in the whip, can actually detect whether or not the question is lying. And I gotta tell you guys, I love that stuff in comics. I have no idea if that's true. I actually tried to look up to see whether or not tremors in your voice, because that's what Volk says. He says that I can tell by the tremors in your throat whether or not you're telling a lie. And so I looked that up to see whether or not that was an effect that lying has, where there are different, tremors inside of your throat. I couldn't find anything to do with that, but I don't care. I love that in comics when they take like kind of like pseudoscience or like obscure theories and then get implemented through a character and it become almost like a superpower in a sense. I love that. That's what fiction is for, to be perfectly frank. So I have no problems with that. So that's what Volk does. He senses that the question is not lying, and so now that he knows that the question is his ally, the question asks him, "Who are you? And what is your origin story? And why is it that you want to make this deal with the mayor?" And I do think this part here, it was a consequence of comics, being short, and so you have to tell a story in a certain amount of pages. Volk gives absolutely no pushback. He's just like, sure, let me give you my origin story. And so we find out that Volk, his parents were gypsies from Romania during the Nazi occupation. And so the Nazis actually kill Volk's parents and leave him for dead. And he wakes up by this river surrounded by wolves. He's half dead, like I said, and the wolves he thinks are going to eat him, but instead of eating him, they actually come and help him up and take him back to their den and welcome him into the family, and he essentially becomes like a man cub, like Mowgli in the Jungle Book. And so he grows up with these wolves being his new family. And so he's a product of both, kind of like gypsy parents with, all of that entails that, as far as like knowing how to travel around and read people and all of that kind of stuff. And then also having this side of him that is all animal instinct and kind of recognizing things via the instincts of an animal. And so that's how it is that he's able to be such a fervent warrior, and also being able to do things, like detecting if you're lying via a whip around your neck. And so he also reveals that essentially after he grew up, he decided to come to America. He moves to Hub City, and he essentially does whatever it takes to survive, which is to become a criminal. Now, again, I think that this is kind of because what Denny does here is paint Volk as kind of like a sympathetic criminal, where he's doing it because it's the only way that he can survive, because he doesn't have the necessary skills to live in traditional life. So he becomes a criminal using his, those instincts and all of that stuff that he had from his past. He becomes a criminal, and he's good at being a criminal, and he does it only to survive. And that's the point that he makes, that I'm a criminal just to survive. And so the question asks him, what is this deal that you're trying to make with the mayor? And essentially what he reveals is that he was going to sell out all the other drug kingpins in the city, because he realized that they were just like the Nazis. They would do evil not to survive, but they would do evil for the sake of evil or for the sake of power, really. But and so he can't abide that, and so it creates this kind of interesting dilemma, which I think is essentially a reflection of the of Denny earlier bringing up the idea of situational ethics, which is, so is it okay for this guy to be a criminal as long as he's doing it for the ability to survive? And and obviously that can apply to any kind of criminal. Is a kid who's hungry and steals bread, is he really a criminal because he's doing it to survive? Versus somebody who's a criminal and could be doing some other kind of job, but they don't because it's easier to be a criminal and it's more expedient to be a criminal, and also being a criminal affords you a certain degree of power. I don't know. Obviously I don't think that the kid that takes bread is probably a criminal. In fact, I would hope that if you see a kid, if you own a bakery or whatever, and you see some kid that's hungry and he can't afford food, that you would give him the bread without any consequence. And so I don't necessarily think that kid is a criminal, but to what degree can you push that? Because this guy has like a criminal empire. Is he really doing it just to survive, or is he doing it because it's the only thing that he knows to do? And is that okay? I don't think so personally, but Denny paints him kind of as a noble criminal in comparison to these evil criminals who are now going to break into this guy's house. Remember the 3 assassins that they gathered before? They now break in, and the Question offers to help Volk to survive, and so Question takes on one of the guys who happens to be a martial artist, and so Question beats him up, while Volk very sadistically kills the other 2 guys. The first guy, he throws a knife at his neck and slits his throat open. The third assassin actually goes running. He doesn't want any part of Volk because he sees what Volk did, and so then the crime boss that hired the assassins is like, well, then I'm gonna go and do it, and so he goes in to attack Volk. Volk starts choking him by the neck. The man has a gun hidden in his sleeve, and he shoots Volk right in the chest just as Volk chokes him to death. And so essentially both of them die. Now, as Volk is dying, the Question starts talking to him, and the man says this very enigmatic phrase that there's a tree out in Romania, I think it is, shaped like a question mark, and then essentially he dies after that. And so the Question, he leaves the scene and he goes back home, and he books a flight to Romania to find this tree shaped like a question mark. And Aristotle is like, what are you doing, man? Like, why are you gonna fly to another side of the country, or I'm sorry, to the another side of the world, just to understand what the last words of a dying man mean? And the Question, or Vic Sage in this case, it says, I need to know the truth. I need to understand what happened. Which again is, I've said it over and over, but that's the driving force that Denny gives Vic Sage, is that need to satisfy his curiosity. He can never leave something ununderstood. And so he flies to Romania, and one thing happens before that. He's actually called by his old TV station, and they offer him a job, and they tell him, but you got to start tomorrow. And he says, no, I have something else to do. And they're like, well, if you don't take the job tomorrow, it's not going to be available for you next week. And he's like, well, then it won't be available, which is interesting, because it's essentially the Question prioritizing his curiosity over an opportunity that he actually really needs to sustain himself. But the Question, it's more important for him to satisfy his curiosity than it is to take advantage of an opportunity. And so he flies over to Romania. He finds the tree shaped like a question mark, and this is it over here in the corner. and he looks beneath it, and he sees a V with a wolf paw print in the floor. He turns around, he sees a wolf with a scar in its eye, which earlier we were shown that Voke had a scar in his eye, and it's kind of revealed that Voke has reincarnated into the wolf. And so he kind of goes back to his primordial nature. I'm not really sure what to make of that, but that's the end of the issue. All right, and so let's get into issue number 8, which I love this issue very much. And it has a ton of interesting stuff that I would like to explore. Give me a second here. I was turning my notebook page and I covered the camera. My bad. All right. So, the issue opens up with this guy being boiled alive. He's hanging upside down. He's being boiled alive. And then we're shown this guy here who's wearing kind of like a kabuki mask. And the guy with the kabuki mask reads him a poem. My object all sublime, I shall achieve in time to let the punishment fit the crime. And this is the villain of our piece. And I find this guy really interesting. So let's get into him. Or let's get into the story. From there, we are taken to a hospital where Vic Sage is being treated for wounds that he, acquired, being the question. And at the same time, he's overhearing a situation where there's apparently like a string of murders that are happening in the city. And so he's overhearing that, and some people, kind of like orderlies are talking, or nurses or whatever are talking in the background. And so the question overhears it. It piques his curiosity. Then this doctor comes in and gives him a shot, and ends up basically telling him to, stay out of trouble or whatever. And so we're introduced to this doctor character, and then as the question is leaving, he ends up hearing the doctor talking to a nurse, and the nurse tells him that, hey, remember that guy that came in the other day that his son was all like burnt up? And well, now he's in the hospital and he's been burned alive and he's dead. And so the question hears that, and he's like, oh, is that some kind of coincidence? The fact that like his son was burnt and now he burns to death. And it's through like scalding water, which is what, we were shown at the beginning of the issue. So it's not just like a fire or something like that. It's he was actually scalded to death. And so the question kind of tucks it away in the back of his mind. And from there, we're taken to this other scene where there's this rather heavy-set fellow, and he's eating a ton, and his wife and his child are starving, and he doesn't share his food with them, and the wife is like begging him for food, and he basically makes it very clear that he's an abusive husband and an abusive father, and that she actually took one of the kids to the hospital because of the fact that he was abusing them, and then child services came and investigated him, and he got upset about the fact that she went to the hospital because it brought attention to him, and so now he's not going to let her have any food and let the kids have any food, and he basically tells her, I'm going out, forget about you guys, right? So like I said, he's a rather heavy-set man, and so as he's walking, he's kind of tired, and so a car comes up and offers him a ride, and he's like, sure, man, give me a ride. And when he gets in the car, it's revealed that it's the guy in the kabuki mask, and he injects the overweight guy with some kind of poison that paralyzes him. And then they park in an alley, and the kabuki mask guy asks him, tell me, do you know what the word flens means? Now, I didn't know what that word meant, so I had to look it up. And apparently it's when you skin the fat. Typically it's done to a whale, when whaling is done, and you're gonna cut the fat off. That's what was it? Flens means. And so that's how the scene closes, with this man asking that very ominous question. From there, Vic Sage, we're shown, is under Myra's direction investigating these murders, and they're kind of talking about it, and it's revealed actually that the question Vic Sage recommended to Myra that O'Toole, the cop from issue number 5, the one that he knew was corrupt, and kind of had this like attack of conscience or whatever, Vic Sage actually recommends for him to be the chief of detectives. And so now this man is actually trying to bring order to this very corrupt system, which is essentially like a theme that plays through the entire series, because Myra is in that same exact situation. She's in the mayor's office trying to establish order in this city that's full of corruption. Now O'Toole is in that same situation, and Vic Sage is in that same situation, first of all as a reporter, but also as the question, where he's in a sense trying to bring order to this very chaotic city that's completely corrupt. And actually that's highlighted in this scene between him and Myra, because they start talking about how on talk shows, like nationwide talk shows, they make jokes about Hub City and about how corrupt it is and how crime-ridden it is and all that kind of stuff. So the city is very, very corrupt, and all of these individuals are trying their best to bring order to a corrupt place. And what that experience is like, whether or not that corrupts you, as you know, it's a very famous Nietzsche expression, so I'm not enlightening anybody with this, but the idea that if you stare into the abyss, does the abyss stare back at you? Like when you're trying to fix corruption, does corruption not essentially like come into you and start warping you from the inside? Is that what's going to happen to the question in Myra and O'Toole, or are they going to be successful when they come up against this corruption? So anyways, the question, he goes back home and he starts talking to Aristotle Roeder. Tot is his nickname. I do this in every video that I call him Aristotle Tot. Tot is his nickname, Aristotle Roeder. Tot. I'm just going to call him Tot because it's easier. So Tot, Vic and Tot are together, and Vic starts telling Tot about the series of murders that he's investigating, and he's kind of narrowed it down to 2 suspects. And he leaves the second suspect vague. He doesn't tell Tot who it is. He says that the other idea that he has is that it's this one specific drug dealer. And the reason that he came to the conclusion that it's one of these 2 people is because all of the murders are surrounding this hospital, the hospital that he went to when he was getting healed, or when he was getting fixed up after being the question. All the murders kind of relate back to that hospital. And so there's his first suspect is a drug dealer that's operating out of the hospital. He's in the hospital, and so he's like basically like working his guys out of the hospital, out of his hospital room. And so the question thinks that possibly it's that. And so he goes out into the street to investigate. Now, as he's out on the street, the same doctor who attended to him is walking through the street, and there's these 2 punks, hoodlums, whatever you want to call the typical comic book guys standing on a street corner looking to mug people. So they see the doctor coming from afar off, and one of the guys is like, oh, let's mug this guy. But as the guy gets closer and they realize that it's the doctor, they're like, oh, no, not this doctor. This guy, he saved my mother's life. He's a good man. Leave him alone. And so the other guy's like, all right. And so then as the doctor passes them, they see another figure off in the distance, and they're like, all right. And the guy's like, look, man, I don't care if this guy is a saint. I don't care if he's wearing a halo around his head. We need to mug this guy. But unfortunately for him, it turns out that it's the question. And so the question like beats them up. And he asks them, what's the name of your the drug dealer that's running things out of the hospital? So because they're all beat up, they tell him. And so the question, he goes to the hospital, and he throws a bedpan at this guy's face. to disarm him, which is funny. And then he questions the guy, and the guy reveals that it's not him that's doing these murders. So the question knows that it's his other suspect. And so, who is that other suspect? The question ends up telling Tot that he thinks that it's the doctor that attended to him, and that the doctor that attended to him, he's this guy that, like, he's basically like a perfect human being. Like, he was, he graduated as a doctor, and even though, like, as a doctor, like, you could work in like a big hospital and make a ton of money, he decides to stay in like a low income situation where he's not making very much money. He's working like 18-hour days, but he's helping like an inner city community. And so Vic Sage has figured out that unfortunately this guy is the murderer. And so he goes to the guy's house to confront him, and he gets there before the man arrives, and he ends up finding the kabuki mask. And so he knows for sure that it's the guy, but instead of turning him into the police, his curiosity, as always, gets the best of him. And so he has to find out, why would this good man do this? Why would he resort to becoming a murderer? And so he sits there in the dark until the man comes home. And when he comes home, he's like, look, I'm the question. Hi. Could you explain to me why you are a murderer? And so the doctor, they have a little back and forth, but the doctor eventually offers up his reasoning. And it's because he spent his whole life healing people and trying to help people and relieve suffering, as he calls it. And at the same time as he's relieving suffering, there's these people out in society that are causing suffering, and they're constantly getting away with it. And so it's very frustrating to him that, while he's trying to help, there's this group of people that are very obviously trying to hurt, and nothing happens to them. Like, obviously sometimes the cops catch up to them and they get put in jail or whatever, but a lot of times that's not what's happening. There's these obviously corrupt people inflicting harm on society, and nothing is happening to them. And so the doctor arrives at a place where he thinks that the solution to this is to kill those who cause suffering, to inflict suffering on those who cause suffering. He says, an eye for an eye. I'm trying to bring balance to society by extinguishing these sorts of people. And what's sad about this is, so I actually spent 3 years working in a situation where I was also in a poor community. I was overseeing a nonprofit organization that aided in a few different ways. We did one of the things, we had like a depression bipolar support group. We did like an outreach for homeless people where we would feed them and stuff like that. And we also had an outreach for prostitutes. So essentially like women that are caught up in prostitution and are being pimped. Essentially the situation that we were in was the neighborhood where we worked. Pimps had different sections of the city that they oversaw, and each of them had their group of women that they would pimp out. And so we had this outreach where we would help women get out of that lifestyle, move into like a safe house, and then essentially like get trained, like education and all that kind of stuff, so that they could eventually go, get a regular job and go back out into society. And so the thing is, I spent 3 years doing that, interacting a lot with prostitutes and a lot with homeless people. And it's very easy to fall into the trap of getting completely burnt out by that kind of situation, just seeing suffering happening all the time. And especially because I actually used to interact with the pimps sometimes. And the pimps actually, it was funny because they're very like respectful when they talk to people that they consider straight or whatever, because they don't want to arouse suspicion, and but the reality is that, you know, we would hear stories from these girls, and, you know, like there was one that, like, you know, like set a girl's face on fire. Another one that like dragged a woman like in his moving car, like dragged her by his, you know, like essentially he had her by the hair and dragged her out on the street on his, you know, in his moving car. And so we knew that like these horrible things were happening. And then on top of that, like the girls, because they were typically addicted to drugs, and even more so sometimes they were just addicted to the relationship that they had with the pimp, because of the fact that, you know, like 10 years before, the pimp had, you know, picked her up while she was homeless, and he had rescued her and all, you know, all of that kind of stuff. You know, these women, they would stay committed to this lifestyle of essentially suffering. It's a lifestyle of suffering. That's really the best way to explain it. And so it was very easy to just get burnt out, to get cynical. And so I can understand the experience that this guy's talking about, where he just sees suffering. But the problem, of course, is that he takes it to an extreme where he starts killing people. And you know, it kind of ties back to that whole idea before of situational ethics. Like, is it okay to kill killers? Is it okay to kill people that are very obviously causing pain to the rest of the world? And it's actually something that the question doesn't have an answer for. And so what happens is the doctor ends up shooting the question with this tranquilizer dart and saying, look, man, I really don't want to kill you, but I have to. You figured out who I am, and you're actually going to be the first innocent person that I ever kill. And so just as he's about to kill the question, he's going to inject him with something. The question actually tells him, I'm not innocent. And he's like, what do you mean you're not innocent? And he's like, no, I'm not innocent. When I was younger, I actually hit my girlfriend one time. I beat up people. I was kind of a bully. And it's very obvious, right? Like, based on the first issue, that how we talked about how, you know, prior to his rebirth, Vic Sage has been a corrupt guy. And so he essentially confesses to all of his corruption. And he's like, look, I am a corrupt man, but I'm trying to get better. And just a few weeks ago, I saved a bus full of school children. There was a bomb thrown into the bus, and I went into the bus and I threw it out. I saved a bus full of school children. And he kind of recounts like some of the things that he's done as the question over the previous issues that are heroic. And so the point there being, is there redemption for evil people? Which is a very Christian idea, and I think it's Denny O'Neill's Catholic background that's influencing this idea that, can you execute criminals with prejudice and think that that's going to make the world a better place? Or do you want to leave space for the very obviously corrupt to change their ways? And so the question ends up kind of posing that as a question to this doctor, and the doctor he says, your argument is compelling, and then the question says, not an argument, a question, and the doctor says, without an easy answer. And I actually really love that, because it's something that I'm trying to learn this. I'm not good at it yet. I'm trying to learn it. Is the idea that you don't convince people by arguing with them. You convince people by asking questions. And I think it's a much more effective way of convincing someone. And the thing is, it actually takes a lot more maturity to ask a question than to argue, because when you argue, you're emotional. And it's very easy for both parties to become emotional, and then really all that's happening is both of you are like feeling self-righteous in your cause, and then both of you, come away having resolved nothing. Neither of you influence the other. But if you ask questions, you have to be sophisticated to ask questions, because in order to ask questions, you have to, number one, you have to actually be curious about what the other person thinks, and you have to be open to the possibility that you're wrong. And so that's why it takes a good amount of maturity to ask questions rather than argue. And so the question here is effective by asking a question. And so kind of the last dilemma here that we're left with is this idea that the doctor, he talks about how he's actually somebody that grew up never causing suffering. He's never tried to harm anybody in his entire life. And so now that he's older, he's seen all these people that are causing suffering. Now he's resentful about that fact, and now he is causing suffering. And so he asks himself the question, maybe because of the fact that I was so righteous growing up my whole life, there was this kind of like buried evil inside of me that needed to come out. And that's actually why I'm causing other people to suffer. And that's also a really interesting idea, because the writer Dostoevsky, he had this theory that in order to be a good man, you have to be a bad man first, which is kind of the idea here that the question is living out, right? He was a bad man, and he has a moment of crisis, of faith crisis in a sense, and then he's changed. That's a very Christian idea. Dostoevsky was a Christian. It's a very Christian idea, right? That you have to be born again. You have to be transformed. So you have to be going in a wrong direction and then repent and go in the right direction. That's actually what makes you a good man. And part of the reason that's a necessary switch is because in order to be a good man, you have to understand how bad people act and why they might act in bad ways. And that will actually make you into the sort of person that's compassionate towards bad people while you yourself are actually trying to do the right thing. But people that, have always done the right thing never have that experience of knowing why a bad person would do a bad thing. And so instead of having compassion for other people, it ends up essentially like making them very, very self-righteous. And you see this in to be perfectly frank, religious people all the time. People that grow up in a religion and, they spend their whole life doing what's right. And then as they start getting older and they start seeing society like, oh, why is this person succeeding and I'm not? And, and they start getting resentful, and then they actually become corrupt people instead of instead of staying committed to their ideals, they actually become corrupt because they become resentful, and that's what makes them judgmental. And that's, a lot of times, like in popular media, that's essentially the picture that we see of Christians is, there are these judgmental hypocrites who castigate other people for doing things that are wrong while they themselves are doing things that are wrong. And it's not always a fair picture of Christians, but it is sometimes. And, I've been in churches, and so I've seen that firsthand. I know that that's a perfectly fair caricature of Christians a good amount of the time. And so there's this passage in Ecclesiastes that comes to mind where Solomon says, don't be, too evil, but also don't be too righteous. And I think that the point that Solomon is making there, if you've never read the book of Ecclesiastes, I highly recommend it, even if you're not a Christian. It's a super awesome book. But anyways, I think that the point that he's making there is like, when you're so righteous that you're self-righteous, it makes you into an unrighteous person. And so it's not to say that you should do bad things, but like you at least have to acknowledge the fact that in you are bad things. And to me, I think that that's actually the problem that a lot of like older Christians face is, it's not that they've never done anything bad, it's that they don't recognize the fact that they've ever done anything bad. And I think that that's actually the distinction there is, even the distinction that Dostoevsky, like from Dostoevsky's perspective of like, you have to be a bad man. Everyone is really a bad man in some way or another, or a bad woman, in some way or another. And it's just a matter of recognizing the fact that you're a bad person. That is kind of the distinguishing factor between somebody who can become a good person versus somebody who is outwardly doing the right thing, but inwardly becoming more and more bitter and resentful, to the point that eventually they do the bad things that they themselves said were bad and that they themselves were judging other people for doing. All right, so in closing, what happens is the doctor, he ends up recognizing that he himself is corrupt, and so he has to execute this righteous killing or whatever, the eye for an eye philosophy, it applies to him. And so now he's the corrupt person, and so he deserves to die. And so he ends up saying, So he ends up quoting his poem. He ends up reading his poem again. My object all sublime, I shall achieve in time, to let the punishment fit the crime. And then he takes the needle that he was going to stab the question with, and he stabs himself with the needle. And he apparently dies. So what happens is the question, at that point, the tranquilizer has worn off. So he goes into the bathroom, washes his face to kind of wake himself up. And then he goes back into the room, but then it turns out that the guy is gone. He disappeared. And so the end there is a little bit vague. So I think that there's two possibilities, right? The first is that the man didn't intend to kill the question with whatever it was that he had in that needle. And so whatever it is that he stabbed himself with wasn't actually lethal. And so then he's able to escape. I guess the second possibility is some sort of supernatural explanation where, essentially he's taken away by the spirit of vengeance, or, whatever the case may be. I'm not really sure either way, but that is how the issue ends, with the man disappearing. And if it is the first, I prefer that explanation. If it is the first, the idea there being he didn't intend to kill an innocent man, and so he doesn't actually deserve to pay for the crime of killing an innocent man, and so he's able to escape and experience what it means to be a bad man, and hopefully now be transformed into a good man. All right. Those were the questions, issues 7 and 8. If you stayed to the end of this video, I sincerely love you. I really thank you for listening to this. You're all awesome. And no matter who you are, it's like the end of, or it's like that scene in V for Vendetta where that lady writes that her life story on a toilet paper scroll. And she says, even though I've never met you and I've never kissed you and I've never touched you, I still love you. And I mean that sincerely. I do love you if you have listened this far. Thank you.